Looking to start your morning with the best in business news? Check out Wake Up with Cheddar.
Catching you up on all of the market headlines that you may have missed.
Uber shares are soaring this morning.
Amazon is crushing earnings estimates in its last quarter.
Delivering all the news you need in just 10 minutes.
Sharing insightful commentary on the daily.
You guys ready?
I'm ready for this.
All right.
Never been more ready in my life. Wake up with us.
Check out Wake Up with Cheddar. Business news with a twist.
The stock market is at a record high.
That's money in the bank. Our success is aligned with the success of the world around us.
It's not all glitz and glam here in the City of Angels.
It's going to be fun.
Here on Capitol Hill, it is an all-out brawl between these candidates.
We need to operate from a place of courage.
Let's now check out what is on the cutting edge.
They bring the data, we bring the analytics and the technology.
There are techniques today which can actually take cells and print them to make an organ.
The internet turned the brick and mortar business on top of its head.
You're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
One of the key issues in this election is women's rights. Sometimes the best gifts come in the ugliest packages.
You don't grow without dips and valleys. If it's always like that, then how do you ever learn?
Well, I think the world has changed. Israel's going to have that leading edge.
Avoid gathering in groups of more than 10 people. Avoid discretionary travel. And avoid eating and drinking at bars, restaurants.
President Trump strikes an optimistic tone there as the world closes up over the coronavirus, adding a number of places need to close. Schools, businesses, entire countries shut down. The president recommending avoiding groups of 10 people or more.
And taking a look at the markets here, global markets plunge on coronavirus fears. The Dow suffers one of its worst days ever, down 3,000 points at its lows. But taking a look at that big board, we saw markets close about 30 minutes ago. The Russell 2000 closing down 14.3%. S&P 500 closing down 12%. Huge declines we're seeing today.
Coronavirus deaths past 6,500 worldwide, with more than 150,000 cases now reported across the globe. As a result, Canada closes its borders and the European Union plans to halt all non-essential travel for at least 30 days.
U.S. Airlines asked for a government bailout of more than $50 million. They say without the help, they'll go bankrupt by the end of May.
And wash your hands, cover your cough or your sneeze. Practice social distancing. What doctors are telling us about staying healthy as the coronavirus pandemic spreads across the globe. Hello, everyone. I'm Derek Dennis.
And I'm Nora Ali. Welcome to an I-24 News Cheddar News special, the coronavirus crisis.
As you can see, Nora and I are on split screen practicing social distancing, and so are many of you at home.
And tonight and every night going forward, we'll bring you everything you need to know about the COVID-19 pandemic, including the devastating impact on the markets. Today, Wall Street saw some of the biggest losses it's seen since the 1980s.
And it's clear that Americans will need to adapt to new routines as states across the country close schools, bars, restaurants, and office buildings. New York announced it has the most confirmed coronavirus cases of any state, surpassing 950.
Meanwhile, in Washington state, U.S. researchers are testing out the very first potential coronavirus vaccine. Still, experts say it will be at least a year before any vaccine is ready for widespread use.
And earlier today, the U.S. Surgeon General, Dr. Jerome Adams, went on national TV and issued a stark warning to all Americans, highlighting how important it is to abide by safety guidelines concerning the coronavirus. Take a look.
Look, we're at a critical inflection point. We have the same number of cases now that Italy had 2 weeks ago. And we have a choice to make. Do we want to really lean into social distancing and mitigation strategies and flatten the curve? Or do we just want to keep going on with business as usual and end up being Italy?
All right, we have team coverage of the coronavirus crisis. Cheddar business anchor Brad Smith is at the New York Stock Exchange, where the markets just closed, historically down. He'll have the numbers and the latest there in just a moment. But first, let's go on to Shayna Estulin. She's live at the White House with today's announcement from the Trump administration. And Shayna, the president calling the coronavirus an invisible enemy, but he still seems optimistic.
I'm not sure I would say optimistic necessarily. I do think he was the most sober and serious we have seen when it comes to addressing the coronavirus, saying that a recession may be coming and really issuing the strictest guidelines we have seen from this administration so far.
We'd much rather be ahead of the curve than behind it, and that's what we are. Therefore, my administration is recommending that all Americans, including the young and healthy, work to engage in schooling from home when possible, avoid gathering in groups of more than 10 people, avoid discretionary travel, and avoid eating and drinking at bars, restaurants, and public food courts.
Yeah, and these are just suggestions. These are not requirements. So we're not talking about a travel ban. We're not talking about a national curfew. Although the president said when it comes to certain hotspots in this country, nothing is off the table. But to your point, Derek, the president was optimistic in the sense that he does believe Americans can come together and that this will pass in the next few months.
It seems a lot of people were expecting more from the Trump administration. There were a lot of calls for nationwide standards on how to combat this coronavirus. The president didn't address that today, did he?
Well, yes, we have heard from states complaining that they want to see national guidelines here, not this patchwork response where you have one state doing one thing and another state doing another thing. But for now, this is what the administration is recommending. It is only for 15 days, though, and it is pretty strict. Don't go out to eat. Don't go to parties or gatherings where there are more than 10 people. Keep kids home from school if you can. And it's really a message that we heard today for millennials, younger people. Do everything you can because it is up to you to protect the more vulnerable population, older people, people with underlying medical conditions. But after 15 days, the task force will reevaluate what they're going to do going forward. But the president did warn that this virus will likely stick around through July and August. But he did say when that is over, when that passes, he does expect the markets to rebound. Derek?
Washington correspondent Shayna Estulin. Shayna, thanks.
All right, moving on here in terms of markets. Global markets continued to plunge today as airlines cut service and public-facing companies shut their doors. On Wall Street, stocks dropped the most since 1987 after President Trump's warning that the economic disruption from the virus could last into summer. So taking a look at the numbers, the Dow closed down 12.9%. The 30 stock Dow was briefly down more than 3,000 points in the final minutes of trading. The S&P 500 dropped 12%, hitting its lowest level since December 2018, while the Nasdaq closed 12.3% lower, its worst day ever. Let's go to Cheddar's Brad Smith live from the floor of the New York Stock Exchange with more. Brad, you've been following this all day today. As President Trump spoke and his coronavirus task force team spoke, we saw the losses accelerate towards the end of the day. What really happened on Wall Street today?
Yeah, on Wall Street, I think there's this sense that there are some of the backstops that the Fed hoped would be backstops for an economic scene right now that is showing that is going to be hemorrhaging jobs, some of those across industries right now. And as we're seeing all of that economic data still have so much uncertainty that it is shrouded in, the markets certainly will continue to decline. And that's just what we're seeing, regardless of the Fed's attempt to insert more to the tune of $500 billion in the repo markets, bringing the total to $2 trillion announced just over the last 4 days alone that we've seen. Of course, they did that last Thursday as well, you may remember. And so that brings us to this $2 trillion total, but ultimately still not enough to really push off some of the panic that the markets have been seeing. The markets have once again hit the panic button, and the start of trading really started with a stop signal today, with the halt that was triggered after the S&P 500 crossed below 8% at the start of trading here on the day. We've really only seen this 4 times in history for a market-wide circuit breaker to be triggered. 3 of those happening within the past week, and 1 of those being today. The prior case being in 1997, where we had seen, particularly on a point basis, that move actually that threshold, actually be countered. And so watching what's happening here on the day and over the past week, the losses have accelerated. We are in bear market territory, ending on Friday the 11-year bull run that we had seen in the markets. And now the major questions that still do linger are, where will we see more movement between the public and private sector partnerships to try and create a vaccine that can then be deployed? When will that be deployed? And then once some of the uncertainty is quelled, how will that impact some of the economic numbers that we're going to still be waiting for, because these are lagging indicators ultimately we're going to need to see, not just in the next report, but then in the report thereafter, how jobs are impacted, how consumer sentiment is impacted, and where ultimately companies will begin to find some footing within their respective industries as well, Nora.
Brad, thanks for highlighting all of that. Such a stark difference from Friday when you and I were sitting together on the floor of the exchange. We saw the biggest single-day rally since the 2008 financial crisis. Thanks to our own Brad Smith. And still to come, more on the economic fallout on Wall Street. The Dow ending the day down more than 12%. More next on the special edition of I-24 News and Cheddar News, the coronavirus crisis.
Crisis is impacting people around the world, including here in the United States. That's ahead as this special edition continues. Welcome back. With the coronavirus cases on the rise around the world, global containment efforts reached a new peak today. Canada is closing its borders to non-citizens, although U.S. citizens are exempt from the ban for the moment. In Europe, the European Commission is implementing a travel ban there. Spain is entering lockdown mode as the First Lady tests positive for the virus. And in the UK, the government is now advising people to stay home for 14 days instead of 7 days if they or anyone in their household has coronavirus symptoms, a new persistent cough or a fever. All right, let's bring in our UK and European correspondent, Jonathan Sacerdoti, for the latest on that part of the story. And Jonathan, the Prime Minister now giving daily briefings on the crisis, and today he introduced new guidance. Tell us about the rules.
Yes, following a fair amount of criticism of both the government's methods of communicating its policies on protecting the public from COVID-19 and the policies themselves, the Prime Minister Boris Johnson has now decided to hold daily briefings for the press. And the first of these took place just a few hours ago in Downing Street. And it saw Mr. Johnson and his scientific advisors introducing new guidelines for the British people. Firstly, he said that those with either a new continuous cough or a high temperature should stay at home for 14 days, and so should their entire household or family. Even trips to buy food should not be made, he said. And the previous advice, remember, was that only the person with the symptoms should self-isolate, and that was for only 7 days. But now they say they want the whole family for 14 days to stay in. Mr. Johnson also said that everyone should stop all non-essential contact with others. That's the whole population. He said that people should start working from home where they possibly can. And he said that British people should avoid pubs, clubs, theatres and social venues. But that is voluntary action, he's suggesting. He's not closing them down so far. And by the end of the week, he said, people in at-risk groups should be largely shielded totally from social contact for around 12 weeks. That's 12 weeks of isolation for those with pre-existing health conditions or those aged over 70. And he said he knew that he was asking a lot of everybody and that the UK had not seen anything like this in peacetime.
And Jonathan, the UK faced criticism from many for being too lax on its rules only a few days ago. Why is it tightening them now?
Well, it seems that they believe they're entering a new phase of the infection, and that is referring to that curve that I think so many in different countries have got used to seeing now, that steep spike. Of course, the British policy had been to try and delay that and to flatten it, to flatten that curve down. But it seems that things have moved a lot quicker than perhaps expected, with Matt Hancock, the health secretary, announcing today in the House of Commons that 53 people have now died in the UK after testing positive. They said that they think it's the right pace for this particular moment to begin moving up the curve, that they should introduce these new rules. And of course, they also said that they're keeping all measures under review and that there could be further stricter things to come.
And Jonathan, after the Cobra emergency meeting, the Queen left Buckingham Palace, right? What's happening with her?
Yes, the Queen, after Thursday's Cobra meeting, she's 93, remember, was taken to Windsor Castle from Buckingham Palace. Part of what was announced today by the Prime Minister is that while that curve is steepening in the UK, it's particularly bad in London, where Buckingham Palace is. So the Queen was taken away from Buckingham Palace by her chauffeur to Windsor Castle, her other residence, and still there is the option of Sandringham for her and Prince Philip, her husband, who's 98. Should the epidemic get worse, they're thought to be better protected there, partly because just the number of people around them is smaller. There's about 500 staff in Buckingham Palace, only about 100 in the other homes, and so that means that there's less chance for contagion there. And also, of course, she will be meeting fewer diplomats.
All right, Jonathan Sacerdoti reporting live from London. Thank you, Jonathan.
As you can see, countries around the world are taking different measures to try to stop the spread of the coronavirus. Governments say they're acting on medical and scientific advice from leading experts, but the measures and their timing have varied widely. And here in the U.S., there's been a fair amount of criticism of the Trump administration's response to the outbreak. Joining us now to discuss if enough is being done to stem the spread of the virus is former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, Paul Rosenzweig. Paul, great to have you with us. A question that's been on everyone's lips, on everyone's minds, is the U.S. government doing enough to battle this outbreak at this point?
Well, I think we can say that retrospectively it hadn't done enough. It appears as though we may be on the cusp of beginning the type of effort that we all would wish had happened 6, 8 weeks ago. We are desperately short on supplies, everything ranging from masks and gloves to ICU beds and ventilators that are much harder to create and ramp up with quickly. Vaccine investigation and hopefully development production is still 12 to 18 months away. It's going to be a very long and difficult journey for the government and for the American people.
A long and difficult and unknown journey ahead, but what's your advice in terms of Americans trusting the messaging, the rhetoric that we're getting? We've seen some contradictory statements and sentiments from President Trump and his team. Who should be the source of truth at this point?
I find trusted sources where I can. I find Dr. Fauci to be eminently credible, and we should rely on him. I think that other members of the public health community are to be relied upon. To be honest with you, I think that Vice President Pence is doing a pretty decent job of trying to stay on message and project the right idea of calm. Yeah, I just touched my face. Sorry about that. But it's going to, American people are going to have to look to sources they trust. It may be governors, it may be their local mayor. Unfortunately, it may not be the president.
And New York's Governor Andrew Cuomo is asking the federal government to step up to the plate and do more, including trying to increase the number of hospital beds and relaxing federal government restrictions on hospitals. Is this a prudent idea, and what more can the federal government do?
Well, the federal government is best at mobilizing large resources that are beyond the capabilities of any particular state. So, for example, if the federal government were to invoke the Defense Production Act and mandate that manufacturers produce more ventilators quickly, that's the type of authority that it has in an emergency that state governments do not. That's the sort of thing that it can do. It can bring the Army Corps of Engineers out to erect emergency facilities for healthcare, whether they're tent cities or Quonset hospitals. That's the type of thing that the federal government can do. It can free up money, and it can provide backstop loans to the markets and things like that that are necessary, like the airline industry.
Looking outside the U.S., the WHO has recently lauded the reactions of China and South Korea in trying to tamp down in their cases in their countries. What do you think the U.S. government can learn from what other countries have done at this point, namely those China, Italy, South Korea, where the outbreaks had originated in the first place?
Well, particularly useful for us is the model of emulating other successful democratic or quasi-democratic countries. We can't do what China has done because we just don't have a society that's built that way. But South Korea was an extremely good and effective model in flattening the curve. Some of the parts of Italy where social distancing went into effect earlier, like Lodi, were good models for reducing the incidence of infection and disease. The places that we should not be following, the models we should not be following, are some of the more laissez-faire approaches of other parts of Italy, where we would want very much to rely upon more than just social distancing.
Paul, we're going to have to leave it there. Paul Rosenzweig, thanks again for your time today. Well, global markets continued to plunge today as airlines cut service and public-facing companies shut their doors. On Wall Street, stocks dropped the most since 1987 after President Trump's warning the economic disruption from the virus could last into summer. Taking a look at the numbers, the Dow closed down 12.9%. The 30-stock Dow was briefly down more than 3,000 points in the final minutes of trading. The S&P 500 dropped 12%, hitting its lowest level since December 2018. while the NASDAQ Composite closed 12.3% lower, its worst day ever. Let's go back to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange, where Brad is with us live watching the markets today. Brad, what were your big takeaways? How are you kind of parsing through this volatility we've seen day to day?
You know, this is a reality for the markets that we have not seen in quite some time, especially on a percentage decline basis. For some of the traders here, this will be their first time ever seeing a decline to the tune of 12% on the S&P 500 or 12% on the Dow Jones Industrial Average. And these are not to be taken lightly. It's considering the response that we've seen, not only here in the U.S., but then internationally, and some of the panic and pandemonium that was driven even before the WHO had declared this a pandemic. And so now watching what the response has been, it's coming solely from DC that we're going to be watching very closely to see how they are interacting with state and local governments to try and curb the rise of coronavirus cases as of right now. But the stocks that are in focus here on the day certainly are things like airlines, as you mentioned, Nora. Let's talk a little bit about that if we can. American Airlines here on the day touched some levels that we have not seen since 2013. Shares of American Airlines ultimately did start to rebound and move higher on the day, and I believe they did close in positive territory at the last we had seen, because one thing that we have been watching is that even when it does touch some of those lows, investors, even throughout the declines, have been trying to figure out where they do set positions for the long-term scale. And that's one thing in the travel and leisure industry where we're going to be watching the accommodations and the travel space, particularly in airlines, try to rebound. And that's going to come off of sentiment like we heard from President Trump in announcing that he was going to back the airlines 100%. That's a positive piece of news for the airlines to take into the next few days of trading here and into the uncertainty that the broader markets are really trying to digest right now. If we're looking at some of the other spaces as well, let's talk about retail, because retail is coming around to what is the new reality of corporate social responsibility right now. And that social responsibility means closing your doors in order to curb the spread of the coronavirus. We've seen this already in Apple in their response and what they did in China, and now how that's being infused into strategies in other places and regions of the world. And so they have announced that they are going to be shutting down all of those non-China stores temporarily so that they can help and do their part. Nike, similarly, doing the same here in the US and some other stores in European regions as well. But then additionally, this certainly hits home for a lot of these small businesses, those businesses that rely on the foot traffic, the gyms that people interface with on a day in and day out basis, and those gyms count on the dollars of their regular memberships. They're having to close doors. Bars, restaurants, all of these small businesses are certainly being impacted. The question is, how long will some of these self-quarantines need to be done? Will there be more of these lockdown procedures that are discussed and then rolled out? And where are these hotspots, particularly that President Trump was talking about in his White House press briefing just an hour ago at this time? And so as we're parsing through all of that detail and the economic indicators start to show some data, even if it is lagging, the stock markets are going to be watching very closely to see how the Fed, who has already cut interest rates, emergency response twice before their meeting that was supposed to take place this week.
We have to leave it there. Brad,
yes.
We'll check in with you in a minute. That's Brad for us at the floor of the New York Stock Exchange.
You got it.
More of our special coverage of the coronavirus crisis.
Cheddar's Need to Know podcast, hosted by Emmy-winning journalists me, Jill Wagner,
and me, Carlo Versano.
Tune into the crypto craze Thursdays at 2:30 only on Cheddar Business.
We are right in the heart of all of the campaign action.
We're going to break up the major banks.
We need a candidate who has real solutions.
So we can bring about the right kind of change.
Real change comes from rooms like this.
Tune in to Cheddar Rides for all the latest in transportation news. Watch Cheddar's Cannabis for all your marijuana business news.
Cheddar's Need to Know podcast, hosted by Emmy-winning journalists me, Jill Wagner,
and me, Carlo Versano.
Tune into the crypto craze Thursdays at 2:30 only on Cheddar Business.
Welcome back to this I-24 News Cheddar News special, The Coronavirus Crisis. I'm Derek Dennis.
Here's a reminder of our top stories tonight. Cities around the U.S. are taking drastic measures to curb the spread of the coronavirus as Americans are living a new normal. States across the country have closed schools, bars, restaurants, and office buildings.
New York announcing it has the most confirmed coronavirus cases of any state, surpassing 950. The coronavirus still poses a threat to the U.S., which is why there's a push for social distancing. The White House is now advising people to gather in groups of 10 or more. President Trump says as of right now, there are no plans of a nationwide curfew or quarantine.
Global markets plunge on coronavirus fears. The Dow suffers one of its worst days ever as airlines cut service and companies shut their doors. On Wall Street, stocks dropped the most since 1987 after President Trump's warning that the economic disruption from the virus could last into summer. The Dow Jones Industrial Average closed down 12.9%. The 30-stock Dow was briefly down more than 3,000 points in the final minutes of trading. The S&P 500 dropped 12%, hitting its lowest level since December 2018, while the Nasdaq Composite closed 12.3% lower, its worst day ever.
And with coronavirus cases on the rise around the world, global containment efforts reached a new peak today as the World Health Organization calls the pandemic a defining global health crisis of our time. Canada is closing its borders to non-citizens, and although U.S. citizens are exempt from the ban for the moment, and in Europe, the European Commission is implementing a travel ban there as France announces it's shutting its borders and banning all family and social gatherings. Spain is entering lockdown as the First Lady tests positive for the virus. This as the coronavirus continues to ravage Italy. The death toll there soaring past 2,000. More cases are now being reported outside China, where the virus originated from, more than inside the country. So here's a look at what we're tracking tonight in our global roundup. In Rome, Pope Francis prays for the end of the coronavirus pandemic. The pontiff left the Vatican unannounced and walked the main streets of what's now an empty Rome amid a lockdown in Italy. He visited 2 churches where he prayed for the sick who have been hit with the virus and also the healthcare workers on the front lines. The Pope also prayed for workers who are keeping pharmacies and grocery stores open during this global health emergency. The Vatican also announced Easter services will be streamed online without the presence of the faithful.
In Brazil, growing concerns among soccer players who are being forced to play in front of empty stadiums. Players from one soccer club taking the field wearing masks over their faces to protest having to play as fears over coronavirus escalate. Players and clubs across South America are demanding soccer authorities take more drastic measures like suspending or canceling all games, including the upcoming championship. One Brazilian pro soccer coach is appealing for soccer to be paused amid the outbreak, saying his players are not, quote, superhuman.
Well, coronavirus has changed the way people are now carrying out their daily, everyday lives around the world, including in the Middle East, where everything from mosques to malls have been shut down. I-24 News correspondent Erica Jackson has more on how countries in the region are being impacted.
A shift in reality in the Middle East as coronavirus continues to grip the region. Iran is the hardest hit nation in the area, with over 800 dead and around 15,000 affected. But some question reported statistics.
I think we can easily say that the current figures might be an underestimation of the actual figures. It's not because the country is not reporting, but because of the nature of the virus.
The deadly virus also sweeping other countries. Lebanon has declared a medical state of emergency and a shutdown, which includes closing its airport and most public institutions and private companies. Gulf countries, including Saudi Arabia, are also closing public spaces as coronavirus changes how people carry out their lives. With houses of worship closed, including the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem's Temple Mount.
In regard to the Jerusalemites and the Palestinians, this is a very sad day that you see Al-Aqsa Mosque closed.
A change in everyday life in the Middle East, and the question of when normalcy will return remains unanswered.
That was Erica Jackson reporting. In the race for the White House, the Democratic presidential debate last night was dominated by the coronavirus outbreak. Former Vice President Joe Biden going head-to-head against Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. But instead of shaking hands, the two presidential candidates bumped elbows. And the debate was moved from Arizona to Washington, D.C. with no audience. The two men standing at least 6 feet apart in order to meet social distancing guidelines. Issues related to the coronavirus pandemic taking center stage as the nation grapples with this public health emergency. Biden and Sanders tried to prove their leadership qualities to a country facing this crisis.
You have a single-payer system in Italy. It doesn't work there. It has nothing to do with Medicare for all. That would not solve the problem at all.
If there was ever a moment when the entire world is in this together, got to support each other, this is that moment.
Well, despite the coronavirus, 4 states are going ahead with their primaries tomorrow as scheduled. Election officials in Arizona, Illinois, Florida, and Ohio say voting doesn't pose a big risk of virus exposure. So let's bring in our senior national correspondent, Michael Shore, on all of this. And Michael, you're in Arizona where voters go to the polls tomorrow in that state's primary. What's the situation there?
Well, I should tell you that the situation here in Arizona is sort of business as usual, maybe with a few fewer people out. In Ohio, though, just in the past little while, probably since you've gone to air, Governor Mike DeWine in Ohio saying that he does not want same-day voting in that state tomorrow, and that's one of the big prizes in the primaries. And it does seem like a lot of this is sort of suspended animation. What's going to happen? The governor here, I'm in front of the state capitol behind me here, Derek. Phoenix, Governor Ducey is holding a press conference at 3 o'clock, and if Doug Ducey says that they're going to proceed with the election as normal, we don't know. But right now, they've cut down the polling places here by about 2/3. A third of them will be open. There's a lot of mail-in balloting. One of the concerns here in a state like Arizona, so many retirees, so many people susceptible to the virus and more of the ills that could come with it. That's what has them on edge in Arizona. But for now, things are going to go on as normal, and I would expect that in a year where turnout has been so far up, the turnout will be down tomorrow, Derek.
So if there is low voter turnout as expected, which candidate do you think could be impacted the most?
Yeah, you know, it's hard to read into that. Low voter turnout does mean that generally the populations that vote with great regularity don't come as much, but those who don't vote with great regularity don't come anyway. So those you'll have the latter group supporting Bernie Sanders on college campuses, those are closed down. You have the nursing homes and retirement facilities. People are being asked not to leave their rooms in those places. So it'll be hard to see if it benefits anyone. I think now, though, there's a sense of a foregone conclusion in the Democratic primary, even though only half of the delegates needed for nomination have yet been won. It does seem like there's a tendency that to believe that Joe Biden has the nomination, and the polling would indicate that as well. He's up by 17 points here in Arizona in the most recent poll I saw, Derek.
And Michael, as for the debate last night, was there a winner?
Well, it's hard to say who the winner was, right? I mean, Joe Biden defended himself. Bernie Sanders was able to get his points across. I think women won last night. Joe Biden saying that he would be running with a woman, that he will select as a running mate in the nomination, if he gets that nomination, a woman. So all of a sudden you have a lot of people sort of conjecturing who that might be. So I do think that if you look at a winner last night, it was Joe Biden because he was able to survive the debate. Though, if this debate had happened even a few weeks earlier, there may have been some fact checking done that could have helped Bernie Sanders then. But I think in the age of coronavirus, people are looking at it a little differently now. Derek?
Sure, we're all talking about it. All right, senior national correspondent Michael Shore. Michael, thanks.
Still ahead, the travel industry collapsing under the weight of the coronavirus, airlines cutting capacity and parking planes, one carrier laying off as much as 90% of its workforce, plus flattening the curve. What can be done to control the spread of the virus and limit the number of infections? That's next on this special edition of I-24 News and Cheddar News, the coronavirus crisis. The travel industry is being hit especially hard by the spread of the novel coronavirus. People are canceling trips at an unprecedented rate amid this pandemic. Let's bring in our reporter, Alan Newhouser, for more on what the future looks like for some of these businesses. Alan, great to see you. Let's start with air traffic specifically. What kind of impact is this having on airports around the country?
Sure. I mean, we saw the footage from this weekend, right? It was a mess at some of the largest international airports in the U.S. Waits of hours, 7 hours longer as airports rushed to institute screenings. And as people rushed home from overseas in the wake of President Trump's surprise announcement about instituting a travel ban for much of Europe, that created a real crunch at so many of these airports and really problematic conditions for folks who wanted to maintain social distancing, but all of a sudden couldn't because of just the mass of people at these airports. Fortunately, that seems to have eased somewhat as of Sunday, in part because people who were going to travel are not traveling anymore. And that's what we're seeing now in this industry as well. Airlines slashing their capacity. For example, United Airlines slashing their capacity by as much as 50% through the next few months just due to the lack of travel, whether out of concern for coronavirus or a direct response to travel restrictions. So quite, frankly, bad times, ugly times for the U.S. Airline industry as this unfolds.
And Alan, many developments just today alone. U.S. Airlines announcing they're seeking government assistance totaling more than $50 billion. President Trump also saying that the U.S. is going to back airlines 100%. What are some of the most recent updates from today?
Those are the big ones. I was also mentioned in the teaser earlier, we saw some really head-turning announcements overseas. For example, the budget carrier Norwegian Air announcing layoffs reaching up to 90%. And there's kind of, I mean, this is a major turnabout, especially for U.S. airlines. Just from last year, the past 10 years have been very strong ones for the travel industry. Airlines last year, for example, Delta said that 2019 was one of its best or the best year that it's had in its history. And then all of a sudden, just in a matter of days, the unfolding of this health crisis. Airlines, based on, from what we've heard from experts, are probably pretty well equipped to handle this in the next few weeks, maybe the next couple months. The problem is we don't know how long this crisis is going to go on for. And airlines are not equipped to handle that, especially because travel is at the heart of this. This is not a byproduct of this crisis. This is really a central facet of this. And that's why we saw the U.S. airline industry today make that public call for major federal help from the U.S. government.
Alan, we've been using a lot of phrases that we used back during the financial crisis of 2008, whether it's recession or it's bailout, that sort of thing. How likely is it that you think airlines will receive any kind of bailout that they might be asking for at this point?
We'll certainly see. The Trump administration has made no secret that they really want to do something for this industry. Last week, we saw statements that airlines are a top priority for this administration. So they're really, you're not really seeing folks necessarily come out and oppose that in an especially strong way. And there's really no doubt. I mean, you just look at the numbers. I mean, again, you look at the stock prices as another indicator. United, Delta Airline posting huge double-digit drops in their market value. So the likelihood of it in these days in D.C., like so much else, it's hard to tell. But there certainly are strong indications that folks are rallying around it.
All right, Alan Newhouser, thank you so much for that report, Alan.
People across the country are being told to self-isolate, work from home, and avoid large gatherings. But what's the right way to self-isolate, and how does it help to stem the effects of the coronavirus pandemic? Well, let's get some answers and turn to Dr. Louisa Petrie, a board-certified cardiologist, nutrition expert, and medical wellness contributor. Dr. Petrie, good to see you.
Hi, Derek. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so let's start with a term we're hearing a lot about, flattening the curve. What is that?
Flattening the curve, actually, what it means, Derek, is starting to slow down the speed of spreading this virus. Right now, we are in an exponential growth. And the slope is very steep, as we can see on this bell curve. And we can overwhelm the healthcare system above the dotted line. When we slow down or flatten the curve, what it means, we spread out the virus new cases over time. This way we can properly take care of them in the hospital system and do not collapse the healthcare.
Right. And so the big fear is what you mentioned, the stress that the coronavirus could put on our healthcare system. Are hospitals around the nation prepared?
Derek, we have never been challenged with a crisis of this magnitude, so we really don't know. But if we look at China and Italy and South Korea, they have more hospital beds per capita than we have. And we are concerned. They were overwhelmed, and this can happen to us. We are 2 weeks away from a tsunami in our hospital system if we don't intervene, if we don't take some draconian measures at this time to stop this spread.
Yeah, and so what do we know about how the novel coronavirus does actually spread? We've heard a lot about bodily fluids, person to person, that way. Is that how the majority of people are contracting it?
Yes, initially we believed those only through airborne particles like respiratory droplets when somebody would cough or sneeze, but also we've learned there is direct contact spread, and that means touching surfaces. We also learned that the virus can live on surfaces anywhere between a few hours to a few days, depending on the surface, and that's responsible for a lot of community spread nowadays.
And you know, there are reports that suggest having a compromised immune system puts a person at greater risk from the novel coronavirus. What are some ways that people can actually boost their immune system throughout this?
Absolutely. We need a robust immune system to fight the virus. Our body needs to make antibody to target those viral particles. And if you're compromised, you're not able to build a response as strong as you should. So the basic ways to improve your immunity, one is sleep at least 7 hours a night, exercise, have a healthy diet rich in vitamin C and vitamin D, and also not to disregard, have a flu vaccine, because if you have the flu, that can weaken your immunity for a few weeks.
Absolutely. The flu is definitely dangerous. So is this coronavirus. We're all just bracing against it both ways. Dr. Louisa Petrie, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, as the U.S. braces for the widening impact of the coronavirus, it could be helpful to look at other countries and see where they succeeded or failed at containing the outbreak. Joining me now is Gordon Chang. He's an Asian affairs expert and the author of the book, The Coming Collapse of China. Gordon, thanks for joining me.
Thanks, Derek.
So let's start with China. And the good news that the latest numbers there suggest China has stopped the steep rise of cases within the country. How did they do it?
Well, we don't know exactly what they did because the statistics coming out of Beijing are supporting ruler Xi Jinping's program of getting workers back to their job sites. And so whenever you have numbers which support a Communist Party program, you've got to be a little bit concerned. But to the extent that they've slowed this down, it's been with quarantines, with artificial intelligence trying to identify where the virus will spread. And they've done, other draconian things, which is what you'd expect from a totalitarian state.
So can those measures that China took work here in the U.S.?
Well, some of them will work. So, for instance, I'm in New Jersey. There's now not a mandatory, but certainly a regimen where you're not supposed to be out on the streets after 8 p.m. and before 5 in the morning. So we're doing those types of things. And I think that we will be accepting those because we realize the severity of this. So even though we live in a democratic society, we can accept coercive measures. And I think we will do that.
You know, Gordon, there is some talk that China might see the virus rebound after the tight measures imposed there are lifted. Is that possible?
Well, I think it's already happening in certain areas. And the reason is because Xi Jinping, from the beginning of February, wanted the country to go back to work. We saw that before the coronavirus peaked, if it has. But we saw that in the early stages of this, he was forcing people back together, and that has caused reinfections in places like Guangdong province in the south, which is next to Hong Kong. Also, we're starting to see cases in Beijing, although they're not publicized. And of course, they've got the reinfections from caused by people returning to China. So there's all sorts of reasons why this might occur, Derek. And also, we don't know very much about the coronavirus. And so this may not peter out during the hot months as other coronaviruses do.
Yeah, a lot of people are looking to see what the summer will bring. Let's talk about South Korea. They seem to have kept a good handle on the outbreak as well, keeping their fatality rate at under 1%. What did South Korea do differently?
Well, South Korea did one thing really well and one thing really poorly. In the beginning, when it really counted, Moon Jae-in, the president of South Korea, said that South Koreans and Chinese were brothers and that the South Koreans should share the suffering. He did not close borders to Chinese travelers. And so, therefore, South Korea had a problem and was actually crippled for a time because of that political decision. But one thing it's done extremely well, better than any other country in the world, according to some accounts, is testing. They've been testing 250,000 people so far out of a population of maybe about 70 million or so. And they can conduct 20,000 tests a day. That's really something that we have not been able to emulate, even though we're supposed to have more resources. So they've done the testing really well, but the testing would have been unnecessary if they had just made the simple decision that President Trump made, which is to restrict travel from China.
And Gordon, has our past experience with other outbreaks like SARS, for example, helped South Korea and other countries be more prepared for something like coronavirus, or is this just so unprecedented?
Well, SARS, which is related to the novel coronavirus, COVID-19, was a help, but also for South Korea, MERS was a big issue. They learned a lot from that, and I think that has really been much more helpful to them in terms of dealing with the coronavirus. So they did some things badly, at the end of last decade, and so now they've learned those lessons. And the same thing is also true of Canada. Canada did very well on SARS, and so therefore its response this time has been better than ours.
Well, that's good to know. I mean, I think we all are just holding our collective breath waiting for when this outbreak will come to an end. Asian affairs expert Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China, thank you for your time today. All right, finally, citizens in Italy are proving that even a national lockdown can't keep down the human spirit. Take a look at this scene in the town of Salerno. People in Italy taking to their balconies. Go ahead, Nora.
Yep, singing and playing instruments to try and keep everyone's spirits up during this nationwide lockdown. The heartwarming videos are all over social media, showing neighbors and friends coming together in places like Naples, Siena, Salerno, and beyond.
Really good to see. A lot of people just stuck in their homes under lockdown. At least they're keeping good spirits and good song about it as well. Thanks for joining us here on this coronavirus crisis, a special brought to you by I-24 News and Cheddar News.
Tune in every day at 4:30 p.m. Eastern Time as we bring you the latest on the COVID-19 pandemic. See you tomorrow.
check out what is on the cutting edge.
They bring the data, we bring the analytics and the technology.
There are techniques today which can actually take cells and print them to make an organ.
The internet turned the brick and mortar business on top of its head.
Looking to start your morning with the best in business news? Check out Wake Up with Cheddar.
Catching you up on all of the market headlines that you may have missed.
Uber shares are soaring this morning.
Amazon is crushing earnings estimates in its last quarter.
Delivering all the news you need in just 10 minutes.
Sharing insightful commentary on the daily.
You guys ready?
I'm ready for this.
All right.
Never been more ready in my life. Wake up with us.
Check out Wake Up with Cheddar. Business news with a twist.
The stock market is at a record high.
That's money in the bank. Our success is aligned with the success of the world around us.
It's not all glitz and glam here in the City of Angels.
It's going to be fun.
Here on Capitol Hill, it is an all-out brawl between these candidates.
We need to operate from a place of courage.
You're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
One of the key issues in this election is women's rights. Sometimes the best gifts come in the ugliest packages.
You don't grow without dips and valleys. If it's always like that, then how do you ever learn?
Well, I think the world has changed. Israel's going to have that leading edge.
Imagine for a second that your phone suddenly loses service. What would you do? You might try turning your data off and then turning it back on again. If that doesn't work, you might even try turning the phone off, giving it a second, and then powering the entire device back on. It's a trick that solves nearly every problem, but it doesn't solve this one. You can't call your phone service provider because you have no service, and it's too late to go to a retail store as they've all closed. So you let the situation sit, hoping it's just a problem with the cell tower and you go to sleep. The next day, you still don't have service. When you get to the store, the sales clerk tells you your phone was reported stolen. We ported the number over to a new SIM card yesterday. But you've had your phone in your possession the whole time, so that couldn't be true. Unless somebody stole your phone number. Once you get it back and get your service running again, you get a flood of emails. All the passwords to your most important accounts have been changed. Any cryptocurrency you had is now gone. You have messages from family and friends confirming that they sent money to you to an unrecognized bank account. This is the absolute worst case scenario in a hack called SIM-jacking. SIM-jacking doesn't have to be as devastating as this example might imply, but there's one thing that shouldn't be overlooked.
Phone numbers were never meant to be used as a method of authentication.
Phone numbers were never intended to be secure. They were never intended to be passwords or to be used for authentication.
It's almost as if nobody told us, don't ever give out your cell phone number because it's more valuable than your social security number or your passport number or your mother's maiden name. But it is.
If there's one thing cybersecurity experts agree on, it's that phone numbers are important. More important now than they've ever been. Because they weren't always so important. Before cell phones, most households had only one landline per residence. But when cell phones came around, everything changed. Phone numbers became individualized. That individualization meant that a phone number could be more than just a phone number.
In the late 90s, phone numbers started being used as identification.
There's been this migration towards, well, then this number is associated with a person, so it can identify them. And then from that identifying, we've sort of migrated, we can authenticate the user based on if they have this phone number or access to this phone number. And really, the technology was never intended for that way, and that's part of the problem.
And truth be told, it wasn't really a problem in the late 90s. It was functional, convenient, and mostly secure, because our phones were just that, phones. But now, our phones are like magic rectangles that we run our whole lives out of. Online banking, social media, health insurance, anything you can think of, there's an app for that. It's incredibly convenient. But if things are too convenient, that means they're probably vulnerable to being hacked. So the security field introduced two-factor authentication. One-factor authentication is using a password that hopefully only you know to log into an account. More secure than no factors, but generally not that secure since the most used passwords in the world are still extremely simple, with 123456, 11111, and password being the most common. So to make it doubly secure, you can use two-factor authentication.
Think about when your bank wants you to secure your online banking account, what do? They send you a code. Where do they send it? They send it to your phone number.
And while 2FA is oftentimes linked to our phone number, the problem is bigger than that. Many accounts allow you to sign in or authorize password resets with your phone number alone. Generally speaking, two-factor authentication is still multitudes more secure than just using a password. But as the terrifying opening scenario implies, our phone numbers are much more vulnerable to being hacked than you might expect.
A lot of times people think you need to be very technically gifted. You don't.
What criminals are essentially doing is tricking the phone provider into switching your phone number to a phone that they control so that your calls, your text messages go to their phone instead of to yours. Then they can receive your one-time password text messages. They can receive your reset password messages. They can receive all your messages.
To do this, hackers have to impersonate you, and it isn't always that difficult. Though it's been cracked down on, one proven method for hackers to do this was to go to a third-party vendor. These stores make money on the phones people buy, which gives them a monetary incentive to switch over a SIM card. Hackers say they lost their phone and need to port their number over to a new one that they're looking to buy. This has become less prevalent as phone companies have become aware of this hack. However, the same basic principle applies if a hacker were to go to their local AT&T, Verizon, T-Mobile, Sprint, or any other phone provider. This is a bit trickier as they might ask for more verifying information, but with a fake ID and a little knowledge, a hacker could facilitate a SIM port. In some cases, this may be difficult if the person has password protected the account, which many cell phone providers have begun doing. But if you don't have a password set up, this could be a piece of cake.
That said, the phone companies have a problem, which is what happens if your phone is stolen and you do need to reset it, right? They need to have a way of making it not too cumbersome and of having ways to deal with the fact that if somebody forgot their password and had their phone stolen, that they're able to get their phone number back. And those are some of the things that criminals exploit.
Once they own your number, they own you. And that is really, really challenging. It's like basically a digital walk-in on your life.
Which means your bank account, your social media, everything is up for grabs. And not just for you, but for any contacts in your phone too, as they might reach out to them.
People that say, my life is boring, and if somebody wants to jump into my life, they're going to be bored and fall asleep. I say, well, understand everyone, every device, every account, every individual is now considered an attractive commodity to cyber criminals. And it may not be about you. People don't just look at you. They look at your circle of trust. They look at where you work. They look at who you're connected to. And even if you think, well, 3 degrees away from me, we're just nobodies, it doesn't matter. Everything can be commoditized and sold on the dark web marketplace to be used for other things.
In the last few years, SIM-jacking attacks have targeted people within the crypto space. A reporter at TechCrunch, who didn't have an exorbitant amount of crypto, was still a victim of SIM-jacking. Luckily, he didn't lose any money, but it wasn't for lack of trying on the hacker's part. The hacker changed all of his passwords. Then they reached out to the reporter's friends and family, seeking 10 Bitcoin to help pay for an emergency surgery with the promise of sending 15 Bitcoin back the next day. The reporter only fell victim to this hack because somebody he knew was attacked first, and that hacker reached out to him. Once he admitted to having cryptocurrency, they saw him as the next target. But physical money isn't the only motive for targeting. You could have other valuable commodities that can be sold for money. It's become commonplace to simjack in order to steal social media handles. The most sought after handles are the simple ones. The one-word ones with no numbers, underscores, or periods. These usernames can be flipped online at a site called ogus.com for thousands of dollars. Gimlet's Reply All reported on a story where a woman got her Snapchat account hacked because the username was Lizard. The hacker was a teenager who was still living with his parents. He and his friends were pulling off multiple attacks on anyone with OG usernames. In this case, the attacker didn't steal any money from her directly and was focused on just getting her username. But not all hackers are going to be so focused on just one method of attack.
And what people need to realize is there's oftentimes cybercriminal syndicates could be individuals working together to pull off a heist of multiple SIM swapping attacks.
While all that seems pretty scary, there are a lot of things you can do to protect yourself. One of the easiest ways is to password protect the account you have with your cell provider. That way, any moves you make needs to be authorized with a special phrase first. Besides that,
if you've already given out your cell phone number, you don't have to move to burner phones for the rest of your life.
There are things you can do that dramatically improve the multi-factor authentication. In many systems, instead of sending you one-time passwords by text messages, they let you run an app on the phone, either Google Authenticator or some other apps that generate one-time passwords every minute. That is bound to the phone, so even if a criminal were to steal your phone number, they would not be able to simply generate that one-time password. It's not being sent to them.
The other thing to be thinking about is think about the email accounts that you use and to think about having multiple versions of those. So you want to have one that you only use with your bank account, no place else. One with social media that you don't use anyplace else. That way, if for some reason an attacker has one email account and your cell phone number and they're trying to trick you, they can only get to one type of account. They can't get to your whole life and start locking you out of your whole life. The other thing to be thinking about is having burner numbers. So you can sign up for a free service like Google Voice or Talkatone, and there's others, and you can get a phone number. And when somebody says, what's your cell phone number? That's the number you hand out, and you forward that number over to your cell phone.
I've been of the opinion, somewhat controversial opinion, that people should not regularly change their passwords. I would say the same thing with the phone number.